How long is it?
20 minutes. Yeah, I'm locked in.
Oh yeah. Oh, is the recording on?
Yeah, recording.
What's up, OG?
Okay. Is everyone here? Alright. Yeah, okay. You guys take notes, guys. Okay. Awesome. Okay, hi everyone, welcome to the Economic Thinking Seminar. It'd be great if we could all quiet down so I can get started and finish within less than 20 minutes. Okay, awesome. So, guys, let's go. So this is going to be about 20 minutes about economic thinking. I am recording. This is going to be posted in the Discord server, so if you guys have any questions, it's going to be recorded. Please save your questions for the end. Alrighty, let's get started. So there are economic motions about markets, motions about distribution of goods, things like that, and these are pretty common. There are also motions that are nominally about things like sports and arts, but are actually secretly about economics. So my goal today is to explain to you how to think about motions in an economics sort of perspective. So the main question here is, how do we produce good? Goods, not just a goods as in an item, but also good as in things that people benefit from. Because people have many different wants, but also there are limited resources. So then we have a couple following questions. How do we choose what to do and what to produce? How do we choose what to have? And how do we choose who gets to have what? And the thing about economics is that it doesn't really ask why people prefer certain things. You should probably go look at like feminist theory for that. But it does ask how to produce those things, how to fulfill those preferences best. So econ thinking is pretty limited, but it has a lot of applicability within debating frameworks because it asks questions like how do we choose under these constraints and also with uncertainty. I'm going to talk about 5 main things today. First, on utility and preferences with the individual. Second, trade, so how people interact with each other. Third, how markets work, how these interactions between individuals actually manifest themselves. Fourthly, how we make decisions most optimally. And lastly, what those optimal states look like. Okay, let's talk about utility. If you've taken Eco 101, you've probably heard this term before. Utility is like how much benefit does somebody get from something. I want to note, though, is that different people want different things, and different people derive different amounts of utility from things. So maybe I get a lot of utility from winning a debate round, but you might get even more utility from me. Your preferences also might be different. Not everybody wants the same things and likes the same things. Maybe I want a really big house and you want a big apartment. Maybe I like dating women and you don't like dating women. Maybe you like pop music and other people like country music. So the amount of utility people derive from different things is distinct. This is important because you want to know in your debating who you're impacting most and why they're the people that derive the most utility uniquely. So you want to differentiate your characterization. If the motion is like, this house would ban zoos, I don't know. Like maybe you can talk about certain actors like environmentalists who care a lot about certain things because they derive a lot of utility from this. Or maybe you can talk about like certain kinds of animals that derive more utility from not being in zoos than others. But the important here is on specificity. You always want to be specific in your characterization, given that different subgroups of people have different utility functions. Why is this important in markets? So something having high aggregate demand, so perhaps like lots of people overall want this thing, does not mean it has high individual provision of utility. So just because lots of people want something doesn't mean that one thing is good for that one particular person. So again, specificity here really matters. I think this is where a lot of debaters fail when they make arguments that are impacted on like society broadly. Like maybe for society broadly, it is good that gross domestic production goes up a little bit. But for the particular individual within that society, maybe this is not very useful. And judges don't find these broad arguments particularly compelling. People like having specific examples and impacts. So characterize people's utility functions and the preferences, and then explain why they actually matter. Second thing I want to talk about are trade-offs and opportunity costs, and then people's different constraints. So the first thing to note is when you make a decision and when you choose something, you're also foregoing something else. So let's say you were deciding to run one argument in your speech. You are foregoing that time spent on another argument that might be even better. So when you're making any sort of decision, don't just think about the cost of something, like buying an apple costs me $5, sure, but also the next best alternative that you're giving up. So maybe maybe the cost of going to debate practice is that debating is like really emotionally terribly draining for you. Also, another cost is maybe you could be at home doing homework, or perhaps you could be with your friends if you're a little more sociable. So when in a debate round, you are thinking about making decisions or perhaps instituting a policy, you also need to think about what other policies aren't happening right now. If the motion is, this house would ban zoos, perhaps the next best alternative policy to this is like, this house would impose some specific restrictions on zoos such that they are better for animals. So when you're thinking about a debate round, don't just think about the motion, the particular topic, also think about all the other things in the option space that is wide and available to you. Next thing to talk about when we're talking about opportunity cost is comparative advantages. So basically, what I want to think about here is moving beyond just thinking about absolute advantages. So perhaps I am better at giving refutation than my debate partner can. Maybe I'm better at refutation, but I'm worse at giving arguments. I'm terrible at giving arguments. Whatever, it sucks. Let's say Cam. Actually, no. I'm going to change my mind. I'm going to give you a different example. Let's say I'm both bad at refutation and bad at arguments. And Cam is just better than me at arguments and refutation in all aspects of debating. Well, I still have to give a speech, right? And so what I should choose then is to do the thing that I am relatively less bad at in terms of comparing them with each other. So perhaps I'm both bad at refutation, I'm both bad at argumentation. Maybe my refutation is just a little bit better than my argumentation in some way, in a way that is different from Cam. And so we have a gain from trade here. I should specialize in doing a little more refutation, even though I'm bad at it, because it means that Cam can spend more time doing argumentation, which is it's less costly to us overall. There's an example here about China and India and wheat and potatoes. This is just an illustrative example. Okay, why is this important in a debate context? Both in terms of your own decision making and how you're splitting up time with a partner who does more refutation or argumentation. But also, it is important when thinking about who should be the actor to do different things in a motion. So perhaps sometimes it's just suboptimal for some actor to do something. Maybe it's suboptimal for the government to institute some kind of policy. Maybe we just really like corporations to do this policy instead, on their own. Unfortunately, sometimes governments just have less costs otherwise. Maybe they're the best actors to do this in this particular case. So I think in a debate round, and when you're thinking about the world in general, don't just think about the absolute level of how good or bad actors or people are at doing things. Also think about what the trade-offs are and whether or not it is more or less costly for them to institute this particular policy. Here are some more applications in a debate-specific context. The first is on burden pushing. So you can make any sort of policy that a government bench is trying to push much more expensive than it seems currently. Because sometimes it's I don't know, maybe I'm trying to think of a motion that isn't the motion that is going to be debated today. Maybe the topic is I can't think of what's not the motion today. But okay, let's say the topic is about instituting some kind of policy. And it seems like you could do this fairly easily, fairly cheaply in terms of just nominal dollars spent. But as the opposition, you want to look beyond just dollars spent and also look at the trade-offs here. Maybe the motion is about whether the Liberal Party should do something. And perhaps it is cheap for them to do something in terms of dollars. For example, have an austerity budget. This is pretty cheap for them to do in that it's not super costly and doesn't require them to spend a lot of money on a new project. But the cost here is on maybe the amount of time and political capital they could have spent on doing another policy. So as an opposition team, you can push on a lot more burden onto the government bench. So don't just look at dollars essentially when you are analyzing a motion. Yes, the second thing I want you guys to think about is identifying the relevant constraints on relevant actors. So, perhaps some actors have other priorities. So maybe you have special obligations to fulfill some kind of maybe as a parent you have a special obligation to making sure your child is happy, and you're as a result, you should analyze how they have a special constraint here and how they have high trade-offs elsewhere on like benefiting other people's children. The last thing I want you guys to do is consider more trade-offs in each policy. I kind of already talked about this, so I'm gonna move on. Okay, so now we know that people have preferences and that they can have gains from trade because different people have different preferences and different people have different abilities and utility functions. How do we gain from this and how do markets work? First, I should define what a market is. Let's just say it's somewhere where you can make an exchange with somebody else, perhaps for a good, perhaps for a service. Maybe I pay somebody on Facebook Marketplace $5 for a used trombone. That is like a marketplace. What is market clearing and why does this matter? So market clearing occurs when an exchange happens, when both suppliers and demanders decide it to occur. Sometimes market clearing doesn't happen even when both people in that exchange would have been better off for making that exchange. Why does this happen? One, sometimes there's poor communication. Actually, an example of this could be the dating market. So perhaps you really like your friend and your friend also really likes you. And it would be positive in the market clearing, it would be the market clearing if you guys if you guys started dating. But because of poor communication mechanisms and perhaps like fears of exogenous factors, none of you guys say this. And so there's no market clearing, and that is bad. The second thing is perhaps there are costs to making exchanges. Like there are exogenous costs that are not being captured within that immediate exchange. Like perhaps there's a really large tax that makes it such that it's really expensive for any good supplier to do such a thing. And so even though a good supplier wants to deliver goods to their buyers, it doesn't happen because there's another tax. I don't know, sometimes there are regulatory difficulties. Perhaps you want to perhaps you want to ship something across the ocean and that's really hard because of laws. So sometimes market clearing doesn't happen, and this is sometimes bad, but also sometimes good. Sometimes market clearing is really bad. For example, the global cocaine trade is pretty bad, but it is also a very active and very liquid market. This is like billions of dollars annually of trading volume, but there are obviously very strong negative externalities that come from this market clearing. Negative externalities, I'm going to talk about that now. So an exchange is not limited to just those two people making that exchange. There are also impacts outside of that just individual exchange. So for example, let's say with pollution, as an oil and gas company, I want to sell oil and gas to people with cars. Car drivers want to have gas. A consequence of this exchange, however, is that there's pollution, there's carbon emissions, and that this contributes to global warming. This harms everyone else who is not immediately in that market. And so the $130 that you spent on gas, the amount of benefit that you've gained from it is not fully captured in that dollar value. There are also sometimes positive externalities. So things like vaccines, it defends you from the flu, but it also helps protect other people from the flu. So this is a positive benefit that is going to affect broader society. Why is this important in a debate context? You ought to consider downstream effects. So let's say the motion is about, what is the motion about? Let's say there's a motion about banning zoos again. You ought to consider not just the immediate effects on people who can or cannot go to the zoo, or perhaps people who, animals who are or aren't immediately in that zoo. There are also downstream effects that maybe benefit other people or the local economy. Perhaps banning zoos harms a local city because that city was really reliant on the tourism dollars that that zoo brought in. I don't know, there are other effects that happen. And so you should think about many different actors when you're analyzing any sort of motion. I forgot to talk about legibility. Oh, yeah, okay. So legibility is important, and what legibility is basically this idea of making yourself knowable and making your preferences knowable. So market participants have to make themselves known as a market participant. Sometimes it's not clear to other people through identifiable traits exactly what they prefer and what they're looking for. This is very relevant in labor markets. So for example, as a firm, you demand labor, and you probably demand high quality labor because you want good people to work for you. This is really hard to discern. They probably get 500 bazillion applications, and hey, I'm sure you guys know some real slackers at the University of Toronto. But you also know some really hard-hitting, strong workers. And so it's hard then in a market to really identify these traits that are desirable, and this requires market participants to make themselves known through things like signals. For example, the University of Toronto logo being, saying that you've been to the University of Toronto is probably a positive signal to your employer because they know that it's a university that's difficult and means that you're hardworking. But what I'm trying to get at here is that there are also a lot of other contingent factors in making market clearing happen. And I think this is important, again, in a debate context, by knowing that just because something exists, just because you are a really good worker, does not mean immediately that you're able to make that happen, realize that effect. It does not necessarily mean that you're suddenly going to be able to match up into a really good firm just because you know you yourself are a good worker. You also have to make sure that other people know this. And so I think a lot of people in debating just sort of assert that because something exists, then everyone will know it exists. This is not true. You have to put in a lot of analytical effort to make sure that in the round it makes sense that other people are going to see these like positive benefits, for example. So I think communication mechanisms are underrated in analysis. Lastly, yeah, sometimes exchange ought not to happen. This is relevant to externalities. Okay, let's talk about decision rules. So when we are trying to decide whether to enter a marketplace, what products to buy, what things to do, what arguments to run in your own debate case, there are many different ways of making decisions. This is best illustrated perhaps with some gambling. Okay, so Jerry, okay, let's say I'll give you an offer, okay? Either I give you $10, or you can flip a coin. If it lands on heads, I'll give you $20. Which one would you prefer?
I'll flip a coin.
You'll flip a coin? Why?
Because I love gambling.
Okay, true. See, so Jerry here is a risk taker. The expected value of both of these things is $10. It's $10 for certain if I give you the $10 for certain. 50%, which is the chance of a coin landing on heads. 50% of $20 is $10. So Jerry just likes gambling, and so he preferred to take the risk and maximize the potential highest payoff. So under this framework, Jerry is following a maxi-max decision rule. So he's choosing the thing that gives him the highest possible payoff, which, assuming the best case scenario. But you could have also decided to take the $10 that was guaranteed to you because it gave you the highest minimum payoff, right? Like $10 is $10 more than zero, which is what could have happened if you had gambled. And this focuses on the worst case outcome and reduces those harms. The reason why I want to talk to you guys about decision rules is because this is important in weighing. So as a judge, when I'm looking at like all the arguments that the debaters in the rounds have given me, perhaps I have some really big, some speculative impacts from opening government. And then I have some really like certain but small impacts from opening opposition. When I'm trying to decide which arguments to credit and value most in my adjudication, I'm using my own decision rules and my own heuristics. So as a debater, you don't want your judge to think. You want your judge to listen to your speech and to decide based off of your speech and your speech only. So within your speech, you should explain what exact decision rules basically that you're optimizing for and why they're useful. I'm going to also explain what expected value is. So expected value is about choosing the alternative or the decision set that has the highest probability weighted average payout over all possible outcomes. So this is to say, Jerry, actually no, somebody who's not a risk taker. James, you look like you're not a risk taker. Okay. Okay. Two options: $10 or $50, or like flip a coin, you get $50. $10. $10. Wow, you're really not a risk taker. Somebody else, Jay. $10 or 50-50 for $50. Sure. Okay. So the expected value of the 50-50 for $50 is $25, and this is a higher average payoff over the possible outcomes as compared to the $10 one. Why do you maximize expected value? Sorry? Okay, no worries. So this is one sort of decision-making rule that you could follow. Another one is like mini-max regret. Actually, this is hard to explain without a chalkboard, but essentially you're choosing the alternative that has like the smallest possible like worst regret case where like your best outcome minus your like worst outcome. It's a thing. But basically, you're trying to limit the possible lost opportunities. So the reason why I'm explaining to you these 4 different kinds of decision rules is because as a judge, And perhaps just as like any sort of actor you're trying to analyze, you might have different risk preferences and tolerances. And so analyzing the actor and their risk preferences and tolerances is useful in explaining why you should make certain decisions over others. So for example, if you are an up-and-coming political party, maybe you don't want to take any big risks that could have very strong negative downsides because it will ruin your credibility forever and you'll never get into government. So that is a reason for you to max in and use that kind of decision rule instead. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is optimal states. So I was just telling you guys about like how to make good decisions, like for yourself and like whatever. But it's not just about yourself. We exist in societies with many other people. So then the question is, how do we distribute goods and how do we distribute welfare across society? There are a couple of different ways. One way that economists love to think about is Pareto optimal cases. So this occurs when any one person's welfare can't be increased without decreasing another person's welfare. This means that all welfare and taxation is basically not Pareto optimal because you are decreasing somebody else's welfare by taxing them and giving those dollars to somebody else. But hey, you know, this is also good because you have increased people's welfare such that they're not experiencing decreases, and maybe that is good. Second kind of optimal state is the overall gene optimal. So this is where the welfare of the least advantaged person is maximized. So you would choose a world and you would choose like a way of distributing goods or like welfare or services or whatever, such that the worst off person is less worse off in other sort of manners. You can also have egalitarian optimums. Maybe you want to make it such that goods are distributed equally across all individuals, just like as a flat line. Perhaps you have desert-based optimal states where individual welfare reflects people's moral desert. So perhaps if you really believe in meritocracy and think everyone should be a grinder, this works pretty well for you because how hard people work is, you know, how much they deserve what they receive. Why am I telling you guys about different forms of optimality? Because not all impacts are good and not all terminal states are good. Another team can claim that they've maximized welfare, for like the least advantaged person, but this is not always the best case. Sometimes maybe you want to distribute welfare equally across all persons. So just because a policy is good in one way doesn't mean it's necessarily good in all the ways possible. So I invite you guys to be a little more critical when evaluating other teams' impacting in your reputation, and also being more explicit with yourself when you're making arguments and figure out what kind of optimal state are you targeting. This is important because as a judge, again, like judges have many different kinds of like ways of thinking about impacts, and I think it's useful for you to make it clear and make your reasoning clear to them. Okay, that's all I had to talk about. I ran over time. 2 books. First, Laws of Trading by Augustin Lebrun is quite good in explaining things like adverse selection, market clearing, things like that. If you're interested, you should definitely read it and talk to me about it. Second, if you're more interested in decision theory beyond like the 2 minutes that I spent on it, you should read this textbook by Martin Peterson, very legible. Third, take Eco 101, maybe take Eco 204. It's useful. Last, you should learn more about distributive justice. I did not do it enough, like in that very, very brief explanation. I've linked an article from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. I think it's quite useful. I think you would learn a lot. Okay, thank you. Any questions?
I have a question about the previous slide. Could you?
Yes.